Orcs are evil, immutably and eternally so. At least that's the case in the Legendarium of Middle-earth by J.R.R. Tolkien. And part of that's because they were intelligently designed by Eru Ilúvatar and awakened at a lake of creation, called by the light of the trees of Valinor and guided to wander and appreciate its beauty as a garden. And Melkor, the evil, a fallen angel in Ilúvatar's service, twisted them, blinded them to the light of those trees. Now they hide from that same light, and it scorches their skin. Malice lives in their heart now. There's two separate acts of intelligent design that have informed the creation of these monsters. Similarly, the hosts, and particularly Dolores Abernathy in Westworld, are sentient and self-aware, or rather some of them become so, and yet their programming, their cornerstones that inform who they are, that are artificially placed there by the designers of their worlds, their internal cognitive worlds, have a great deal to do with who they are. They can't change it. They were made, not born. That's intelligent design that's informing this species. And in a role-playing game, you could conceivably play one of these hosts, but there would also be things that your character could not help. And the same would be true if they were NPCs. The game master might show some implacable will behind a given group of hosts, something that they could not help doing because it was part of their core narrative. Are we programmed as human beings? Is there parts of us that we can't change? Well, Westworld is working to answer some of those questions, and I'll leave them to ask them of yourself and of our own world that we're living in. And this video is not about that. A tiger can't be a vegetarian for the same reason, but simply out of natural selection. Their gut can't do it. In the genre of fantasy, this question of choice-making capability is something which is explored with different foils, the elves and the orcs, that have certain predilections which have to do with how they were created and not born. In science fiction, there are similarly a lot of artificial intelligences. Science fiction has been exploring this question of what differences, which often arise from biology, can be worked out and lived and lived with when it comes to aliens and humans. What can you abide in alien neighbors in spite of how repugnant it might be for yourself? And how far will you let that go? How far will the aliens be asked to let something go about human nature? Something that science fiction has been exploring. Do you think that in tabletop role-playing, your group has the moral agency to explore these topics? Some? Do you think that you as a game master and a world builder can explore some of these same questions when you're doing world building? I ask these questions because out there in the wider internet, orcs are racist and stat bonuses are racist is a very hot topic that has blown up again. People are trying to tell us that this is an affirmative nod from the game about things like race science, which is a nonsense garbage talk thing that people do, which is a lot like flat earther and flake moon landing nonsense about how different ethnic groups of human beings have natural differences. I hate to break it to you, but just basically anybody could have invented general relativity. Anybody can become a brain surgeon, a rocket scientist, or a marathon runner. And the differences between different ethnic groups of humans on the genetic and physiological level are just only seen at the highest heights of like who gets the gold medal like 1 out of every 4 Olympics. And in those same Olympics, we now have the technology that certain people cheat, and the needle moves all over the place because of that. So given that, and most of us have the normal sense to reject garbage theories like flat earth and, fake moon stuff, that do you really worry that stat bonuses to elves are gonna warp your mind. Now, there could be some teenagers out there. There could be some young kids that might arrive at different ideas, and in their own time, using the internet, which we have access to, and possibly going to college and meeting different interesting people, both at parties and also in classes and being lectured. Do you think they will rise to exceed some of those things? They might read in a book about elves and goblins and kobolds and dwarves and so on, and they might make a kind of a fun house mirror sort of world building in their younger years, where these different species are instead portrayed as cultural pastiches of different things in our own world. That's a possibility that might happen. Is that user error? Is that just sort of the natural mistakes and possibly learning from mistakes? Now, I have nothing against kind of giving some warnings about how you can be insensitive when you're creating things in your worlds in role-playing games, and you should be aware of that. But that's not a universal. I'm not saying if you put orcs in your game that are evil, you are being a racist. You notice the difference? Because this is the narrative that's out there, is that there's something fundamental about stat bonuses for player character races like dwarves, elves, and halflings. And there's something fundamental about putting fundamentally evil humanoids in your world that will inevitably lead to an injury to the culture of tolerance and mutual coexistence and cooperation that we have out here in reality. That in the fantasy world, regardless of the reasons that might inform why these different species or races are different, whether it's to explore questions of free will, whether it's to explore questions of biology, that inevitably coming out of the game, the argument is that filtering out some sort of insidious tentacles of evil prejudice will get into us. Now, how does that sound familiar to you? I mean, it sounds very familiar to me as far as demons and devils and different sorts of magic and creatures that were in the Dungeons and Dragons of the 1980s. And what happened? Well, there was a moral panic, largely by people outside of the hobby, and that one of the nods to this moral panic, one of the accommodations that was made by TSR, is that they renamed the angels, they renamed the devils and demons, and they called them Batazu and Bator and Eladrin and Devas, and which is appropriated from Indian mythology, but never mind that. It was a thin coat of paint placed on something which was a mythological underpinning of the world that the games existed in. That, naturally, we recognized that people were still going to want to play with these mythical creatures in their worlds, and they were still in the monster manual even after the thin coat of paint. They were a tool for exploring different kinds of storytelling, for understanding different sorts of themes in the worlds. And the question is, do you think role-playing is a mature enough, an adult enough hobby that occasionally, at least, it can explore these same questions without, getting its users into a moral quagmire? Do you think that you can responsibly role play with this sorts of thematic exploration on the table? Or do you think it should be taken off the table? Do you think you should be warned constantly? That's a question that I have for you. And for that matter, here's another way of putting it. Do you think that anyone who does have universally evil orcs in their worlds is a stupid? Do you think that that's definitely always a user error? That if someone has evil orcs that cannot exceed their programming, and that was put there by Melkor, for example, that means that the person who's running those orcs is, either by negligence or by willful dog whistling, putting racist ideology out in the world? Or do you think they might have good motives, or at least neutral ones? I don't think that you're always stupid if you do these things. And even though Carnival Row and the whole idea of using different fantasy races as sort of a stand-in for real world cultural differences is not my taste. Um, I'm not so judgmental as to say that everyone else should stop doing that. That it's bad news bears to, have that sort of world building where you have different barrios and ghettos where different fantasy species might cohabitate. I mean, after all, that's sort of what the Star Wars galaxy looks a lot like visually. And personally, I've had some fun role playing in the Star Wars galaxy. It seems like I should live and let live when it comes to this creativity thing. So, the question that I really have for the angry people out there in this debate right now is why not ask the question of what kind of orcs are you running? Are you running mythical orcs that have an intelligently created backstory, that there's something programmed into them? Are you running tribal orcs that are, maybe something like a subspecies of humans, something like Neanderthals that, there's no reason that coexistence and interbreeding and eventual kind of cohabitation between species is possible? Are you running alien orcs like in Azeroth, where they're just a different species that are informed by a different biology, a different evolution, a different history, a different context, but are in many respects people that can exceed who they are and what they are handed in life? Because one of the things that I hear and read in these criticisms of immutably evil orcs and of racial stat bonuses is an idea that the user, the dungeon master, and the player are ignorant to this sorting hat, that we're incapable of framing our worlds and hearing the game master's depiction of them and perceiving that difference between cultural pastiche and science fiction differences in species and mythical created worlds where law and chaos are like forces of physics. That, ultimately at the end of the day, everybody will just see, hear, and subconsciously transmit the racist pastiche version of species. And so we can't be trusted, or, someone might be uncomfortable at some point, in ignorance of which of these it might be. And sometimes people will even say that the bad guys that are out there, the white supremacists and so on, that want to use these concepts for their own racial allegory nonsense, are the real danger. And so we should all kind of keep a weather eye out and maybe self-censor ourselves when it comes to these topics in order to not create a fertile ground for the bad guys. Well, I put to you that in the same way that J.R.R. Tolkien flirted with some of these concepts and used some descriptions that make us uncomfortable now and played on people's fears with certain word choices, he also wrote some very touching passages about the Easterlings at the gate, and Frodo and Sam witnessing the Southrons fighting in the Ithilien. And they deeply empathize with these people from another part of the world, these humans. And there's an understanding in Frodo and Sam with their incredible hobbit's capacity for empathy, which might be something put there by the author so that we can see different points of view. We see that these folks from other parts of the world are the victim of an accident of geography. There's nothing fundamentally bad about them, and the opportunity for them to make a choice towards good and to turn away from the will of Sauron, or even that they have been driven into these wars by kings that have been tempted by the power of the rings rather than themselves being immutably evil. Well, that's something that the author takes some time to do, to tell us that we're all human, but that there might be things that might get created in this world, like the hosts of Westworld, that might not be human, that might have a different nature. We share this world with animals. We may share the universe with aliens that have a different nature. These are fun ideas that I think that we're mature enough as role players to use at our tabletop. What do you think? I'm the Complex Games Apologist.